I was a teenager trying to figure out myself in the world as a teenager while also navigating life in a new country, while also feeling like I was responsible for my younger sibling that I had come here with. So I just kind of felt like it was a lot to navigate. Like there were days where I just wanted to just do nothing. Like I don't want to study. I don't want to get good grades. I don't want to be a parent, even as a child. There were just days where I didn't want to do anything, but I just felt like I didn't have that luxury. So my name is Ella Harry, and I am a Nigerian-born Edmonton resident who has called Edmonton home for about a decade. The journey to being an international student here in Edmonton was very non-linear. When I first moved to Canada, or even before I moved, there was no sort of conversation that my parents had with me. It was just more so, you're going to Canada, and I'm like, oh, okay. And at the time I was 15 and I had a brother, or I have a brother who was 14 at the time. So we first moved to Fort St. John, BC, and the whole idea was, oh, you're going to start off in a small city, nothing too crazy, get comfortable with like the Canadian life and how things kind of operate. And then once you've kind of gotten settled a little bit, you can move to a bigger city for university. So when I was in BC, I redid grade 12, so did my brother. And then we applied to a bunch of universities and we're like, oh, we're just going to go to wherever gives us like the highest scholarship, because again, international students, you really need all the money you can get, all the help you can get, especially with tuition. So that's how I ended up in Edmonton. And I remember saying, oh, I'm just going to do university and I'll be here for 4 years and I'm going to go to like a bigger city where I can go live my best life. It's been 10 years in Edmonton and I cannot imagine living anywhere else. Okay, so I'm going to be using this word a lot, non-linear. The immigration journey is non-linear. There is no one way to move to Canada as an international student. So I'll give you an example. From Nigeria, kind of the first few steps that you have to do is to make sure that your child is eligible to move in terms of like the grades that they have, the courses that they have, what they're going to need. If you apply to universities in Canada, are those schools going to recognize kind of the classes that they already have? So those are some of the first things that you have to do. You have to think about. Then you have to think about how much money you actually have. Because to move to Canada, you need to show proof of funds. Can you take care of this child? Can you afford the tuition? And the tuition is expensive. International students pay 3 times the cost of the average citizen or permanent resident in this country. So for your child to move here, you have to show that you have the funds to be able to take care of them. So not just their tuition, but also their rent, their food, their textbooks, like everything that has to do with them living here for the duration that they're going to be here. So then while you move here as an international student, after you've shown all of that in terms of like proof of funds, then you can apply for a student visa. Again, it's very non-linear. For some people, it might take 6 months. There are people who waited 2 years to get those visas. So while you're waiting, you're just doing other things. So your child could be at home or they could be working. Very rarely do Nigerian kids go do hardcore work. It could just be maybe helping their parents out at like their jobs or things like that. So you apply for the student visa. Now you're here in Canada, right? And in my case, my parents applied for the student visa. And then I came here with my brother. While you have a student visa, at that time anyways, you could only work 20 hours a week. For international students, in certain ways, it makes sense because the primary reason why you're here is to study. So they don't want a situation where work is now taking priority. So you're only working 20 hours a week. But then when you think about all the expenses that you have and everything else that your parents are having to pay, you realize that you can't contribute as much because 20 hours a week is not a lot of hours, considering the fact that you can't even get a corporate job or like a decent enough job. So there's that. So you're here even trying to go back home, you can't just go back home to visit Nigeria with a student visa. At least at the time when I was in school, if I wanted to go back home to Nigeria, I had to apply for a re-entry visa. So that meant that I needed a visa that would allow me to re-enter the country if I left. So you couldn't just buy a ticket and just get your passport. Like it didn't work that way. It was a whole process, even going back home. And mind you, that visa could actually get denied. So you could actually get denied a re-entry visa. So what that means is that you can't leave the country, because if you can't come back, there's no point living. So there was that issue too, even trying to navigate that. So I remember sometimes, like, I remember I had friends who sometimes just wanted to go visit home, even just for like a short time, but they're like, oh, I can't buy a ticket to live in a month because I don't have a re-entry visa. So even that's kind of affected how you could move in and out of the country and how you could move between Canada and Nigeria. So that is pretty much how the student visa works. Something else with the student visa is that it expires. So depending on when your passport expires, your student visa might be expiring as well. So there was also the added cost of having to renew that student visa whenever it expired, which of course is very stressful because you're already doing so much. You're already having to deal with a lot more things. And that's just one extra thing that you have to do as well. So when you're in school, you've done the student visa, you're in school, you're taking classes, that is another requirement of having a student visa. And I think that is something that also contributed to me feeling like I couldn't just take a break. When you talk to Canadian students, if they're going through stuff, or maybe they just don't feel like being in school, or maybe they want to travel, whatever that looks like, they just tell you like, oh, I'm taking a year off to travel, or like, I'm going to Europe for 6 months. As an international student, you can't do that, because as long as you have a student visa, you have to be in school. If you're not in school, if you can't prove that you are in school, it kind of begs the question, like, should your visa still be valid? Because what are you doing here? The whole point of being here is so that you're in school. So if you're not in school, like, what are you doing here? So you don't get to take a break. Even if something happened, even if there was a death in the family, you don't just get to take a break. You have to keep going because your visa doesn't allow you to take breaks. So when you have this postgraduate work permit, you have 3 years and they expect you to find a job, work a job for a year, and then apply to be a permanent resident of Canada. If you've ever been a new graduate, or you know someone who has been a new graduate, you know that it takes a while to actually find a job. Except in this case, you're not just worried about finding a job, you're also worried about your immigration status, because time is going as you're, looking for a job, taking time is going. I remember being so stressed out because not only did I not have a job, to take care of myself, I was like, okay, like, I have 2 more years left, or like, I have a year and a half left. Like, what's going to happen if I don't find a job? Like, what's going to happen if I haven't applied to be a permanent resident of Canada? Like, am I going to go back home? Like, how is this all going to work out? So I was just really stressed out about everything. And then I ended up moving back to BC. So the first city that I had initially landed in when I moved to Canada, Fort St. John, BC. I ended up moving back there because it was a smaller town. It was easier to find a job because a lot of people are not really, especially younger people, are not really trying to move back to a small town. But I'm like, I have to take one for the team. At the end of the day, I have to be able to apply for my immigration documents. So I moved back there. I was there for a year and a half. I worked a job as a mental health clinician. And when I applied to be a permanent resident of Canada, while my application was in process, I moved back to Edmonton just before the pandemic hit. But just thinking about that, and then once I got my permanent residency card, you have to wait about 2 years, I believe, before applying for citizenship. So I just got called like 2 weeks ago to take the citizenship exam, and I moved to Canada 10 years ago. So you can imagine how just long and daunting the whole process is. So when I use the word non-linear, it is really non-linear, because if you talk to another international students, their journey is completely different, very different. It just depends on who you talk to, but it's definitely something that is not straightforward at all. I think sometimes the expectations that you have as a teenager can be very different from what the reality is. I think expectations in general can be different, but when you are a teenager, you don't really know a lot about a lot. So it can be very jarring when the reality is not exactly as you pictured. So I remember being in Nigeria and just hearing that I was coming to Canada. I was so excited, even if it wasn't a conversation that my parents had with me. I was so excited because I'm like, oh my God, I'm coming to Canada. It'll be great. I'm going to go to school there. It'll be amazing. Things will be so easy. I'll live my best life. I'll have all of these friends because, of course, those expectations were primarily dictated by like media and what I was watching, right? So when I moved here, especially moving here without my parents, without any sort of like family, I had never been to Canada before. I didn't know anybody. It was very interesting, especially when I moved to Edmonton. The biggest thing that I noticed was just the culture shock that I had. So from even just having a Nigerian accent to doing things differently, there was just that shock. And it was very hard to reconcile my Nigerian background and childhood with my current reality of being a teenager who was navigating a new city without their parents. The second thing was just the way of studying. The educational system in Nigeria is so different from the educational system here in Canada. One, being in Nigeria, you have to cram a lot of stuff, you have to know a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of emphasis on getting good grades. So like first position, second position, third position, things like that. In Canada, even though there is emphasis on getting good grades, there are other things that you have to be able to do. So for example, you have to be able to work as a team. You have to be able to do group work. You have to be able to learn in so many different ways that don't involve like studying and just like writing an exam. So all of those different things kind of made it a bit tough to navigate being an international student. And again, just the lack of community, because you then have to just build your community. You're not here and community is just waiting for you. It takes an intentional effort to also build a community when you're an international student. So it just makes it that much tougher. Okay. So when I moved to Edmonton, I didn't really know what I wanted my life to look like. I just knew that my brother and I were coming for university, and the goal was to get good grades. Because again, you're paying international student fees. The last thing your Nigerian parents wants to hear is that you're not getting good grades. So that was the primary goal of just like, you know, being in Edmonton, let's put our heads down and get good grades. But then when I started university, I also had friends who had been in BC, lived in BC at the time, who were kind of doing the same thing, you know, go to BC and then move to a bigger city. So we knew a few people who had also applied to U of A as well. So we all decided that we're going to apply to the dorms and we're all going to live together. So that was kind of an intro into just like building my own community. But again, these are people that I met like 9 months before. We'd never met each other before then, right? So we were on campus at the U of A and we were all still just trying to navigate life together. So we would go to class together, we would do assignments together, we would go grocery shopping, we would cook together. We literally did everything together, even with Christmas and Thanksgiving and just all the different holidays, or like over the summer when people would go home for the time being, we all just had each other. So we would have like a little cookout in someone's dorm and we would all just gather and tell stories and play music. So that was how I slowly built my community on campus. And a lot of those people are my friends. Even like 10 years later, we're still friends. We still talk to each other. But I would say it took a lot of intentionality to be able to do that. Okay, so what were some of my highs as an international student in Edmonton? Something that I still think about till this day is just the gatherings that I had with other international students. So as you can imagine, for Christmas, if you're from Edmonton or even if you have family in Canada, for Christmas, you can go home, like you're going home to your family. For Thanksgiving, you're doing the same. International students don't really have anywhere to go. So it's not like we can go back home to Nigeria every Thanksgiving or every Christmas or every Easter. Unfortunately, we just didn't have that luxury. So something that I started doing when I was in school, I remember just like living on campus at the U of A, is I would get other international students, mostly Nigerian students, because I didn't want a situation where like people were by themselves on holidays where they should have been spending time with family. Because I remember the first time that I did it, I know how I felt. I felt really down. I felt just like, I'm like, oh, like I wish my family was here. I wish I could go back home. Or I wish I had something like it's Christmas. People are out there living their best lives. And I'm just in the dorms, like watching TV. So I know how I felt, and I didn't want other international students to feel that way. So the next year, I started to tell other like Nigerian international students, like, hey, like if you're not doing anything, feel free to come over, and we would do this for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for Easter. We would do this every single year. So 1 year turned into 2 years, 2 years turned into 4 years. And we just continued that tradition. I know the first time we did it, we probably had like 5 to 6 people. By the fourth time, there were at least 20 people at my house. And by the fifth time, we were close to like 40 people because different people just kept bringing their friends. I would say that was the highlight of just being an international student. It's something that I still think about so often. I wish that I could continue to do that, but I think we're in very different places now. People have grown, people have moved on. But that is definitely up there for me. And then some of the lows was just being able to, I think just the fact that I was a teenager trying to figure out myself in the world as a teenager, while also navigating life in a new country, while also feeling like I was responsible for my younger sibling that I had come here with. So I just kind of felt like it was a lot to navigate. Like there were days where I just wanted to just do nothing. Like I don't want to study. I don't want to get good grades. I don't want to be a parent, even as a child. There were just days where I didn't want to do anything, but I just felt like I didn't have that luxury because as an international student, if your parents are paying a trailer load of money for you to be here, you don't get the chance or the opportunity to just break down or to just be an average teenager. You don't get that chance. You have to keep going regardless of whether you want to do it or not. So in terms of lows, like even when I think about it now, it's just something that I'm like, wow, as a 17-year-old, I can't believe that that was my life, right? So I think that would be like a very low for me as an international student. But it also got better, but it didn't happen overnight. Okay. So when you move to Canada, or I guess anywhere, but let's just talk about Canada. When you move to Canada as an international student, and there are a lot of things that you have to think about. There are a lot of financial implications, not just for you, but also your family back home. One being if they're sending you to Canada. In my case, my brother and I were here at the same time. And then 2 years later, the remaining 2 of my siblings joined us. So at this point, there were 4 kids in Canada, 4 international students in Canada. If you know anything about how much international students pay or what our lives here are like, you know that that is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. I believe that the average Canadian could not afford to pay that much money per child per year. Based on the Canadians that I've spoken to, based on the research that I've done, the average Canadian would not be able to afford that. So you can imagine that even like families back home in Nigeria, it's not because they're filthy rich. It's just one of those things where they're like, oh, I feel like my child needs to have a better life. I'm going to make whatever sacrifices I need to make to ensure that my children are educated, my children have a better life than I do. Depending on what that looks like. So families back home are giving up a lot. I remember like growing up, there were no such things as like vacation. Look, we didn't have vacations. We weren't going on trips. We had a very basic life, like 2 cars, sometimes 1 car, a basic house. We're eating the most basic things. We didn't really have a lot of luxuries because my parents had the end goal of sending us abroad. So that is the one financial implication. The second thing is when things go south, it's hard for you to keep going. And I can tell you exactly what I mean. So in 2014, there was an economic crisis in Nigeria. And I remember this vividly because a lot of Nigerian students here really struggled because, of course, their parents could no longer afford their tuition. You could no longer send money in and out of Nigeria. It was very difficult. So if you were an international student at that time, you either had to hustle, which would have been very difficult if you're working 20 hours a week, or you simply just had to take a break. I know I had friends whose parents could just no longer afford it, so they had to take a break from school, as you can imagine, which was very stressful because as an international student, you don't have the luxury of taking breaks. You're on a student visa. You can't just decide, oh, I don't want to go to school this semester, or oh, I'm going to take a break for a year. Like, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. You're not Canadian. You're not a resident. You don't get to do that. But the fact that the economy was so bad that they had to take a step back was also an added stress because it's like, oh my God, is immigration going to find out? Oh my God, am I going to get deported because I couldn't afford to pay my tuition? Just things like that. But then with the average Canadian student, I want to say, like, if things were going south for you financially, if you could no longer afford to pay your tuition, you could just decide, okay, I'm going to work for a bit, I'm going to save up money, and then I'm going to pay my tuition. As an international student, when I was in school, I think my tuition was about $20,000. 20,000, there's no kind of job, there's no kind of retail job that you're going to work 20 hours a week that would pay you $20,000 for a whole year. And that's just your tuition. You're not talking about your rent. You're not talking about your food. You're not talking about your textbooks. You're not talking about everything else that you need. That's just your tuition. There's no kind of job that you're going to do that would pay you that much money. So in terms of financial implications, it just kind of made it very difficult for international students to be able to survive if their parents weren't able to provide for them. So not that this was like my personal experience, but I also know that there were international students that had to do things that they were not necessarily proud of because somehow you just have to survive. If your parents are not able to help you do certain things, then you have to find a way to be able to help yourself, right? So in terms of the financial implications of being an international student, there's so many things that you have to consider. And then the mental load. It's very hard to not realize that you stand out. It's very hard to not realize that you stand out. As a Black child, it's very hard to not notice that you stand out. Not just the way you look, but also the way you sound too. When I moved here, I still do have a very Nigerian accent, but then international students get so comfortable code switching because you have to. It's almost like a coping mechanism. It's almost like a way to kind of blend in. So you learn how to sound more Canadian. You learn how to act more Canadian so that people can accept you, so that people are not asking you, oh, did you speak English? Oh, I didn't understand what you said. Oh, can you say this again? Even though you might be smarter than some of the people that you're maybe working with in your group, even though you might be getting good grades, even though things might be looking good on other fronts, if you don't sound or act Canadian, it's easy for people to think that you do not deserve to even be in those spots, which makes it very tough because it can be tough on your self-esteem. As an international student, it can be tough on the way that you even view your journey, because if people are going to see me as not deserving, if people are going to see me as though I don't belong to be here, why would I try? Why would I try? I might as well just let them think what you're going to think, and I can just move on with my life. So even just that mental load of being in a place where you know you are different, like something that kind of stood out to me, or an experience that still stands out even to this day, is when it was legal for me to work as an international student. So when I started, you could work 20 hours. You could work full time during the summer, but you could work, I believe, an on-campus job. They changed the rules, and international students could now work 20 hours while still being in school. So anyways, I remember like being able to work for the first time. I was so excited. I started applying for jobs. I polished my resume. I had nothing. I had zero experience on my resume, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to go apply for jobs. I'll apply everywhere. At this point, I can't be picky. As long as I can access that place using public transit, I'll apply there. And I remember going to this specific restaurant, And I told them like, hey, I was just wondering if you're hiring. And they said, oh, we don't hire international students. That's exactly what they said. It's actually, it's as shocking as you think it is. Because in that point, I'm like, I never mentioned that I was an international student. You didn't even know my name. You just saw me and you kind of just assumed, maybe based on how I looked, maybe based on how I presented, maybe based on my accent. And they just kind of assumed that, oh, this person's young, they're probably an international. They're like, oh, we don't hire international students. And I was a bit confused because I'm like, what about me gives you the vibe that I am an international student? But even if that's something that you're doing, why are you so comfortable saying that out loud to an international student who is applying for a job? And this is a major restaurant. This is a major restaurant in Edmonton. I found that very interesting, and I was a bit confused. Like, I didn't really know what to make of that. But again, when you're young and you don't really have adults in the same country as you, your parents are not there. It's not like I had like aunties or uncles or people that I could reach out to. It was still just like my fellow Nigerian international students, all just trying to figure out life together. So even though I had like certain feelings about that situation, there wasn't really someone that I could go to be like, hey, like, this is what happened. Like, this is how I'm feeling. Like, what do you think? Like, does that make any sense? It just wasn't something that I could even process. I was like, okay, cool. I guess I'll just keep applying for jobs. And something that I remember vividly doing after that was I stopped using my Nigerian first name in documents. So my resumes, nobody knows me as Essie Ogene, which is my Nigerian first name. I'm like, because once you see my name, regardless of how educated I am, regardless of how I present, once you see my name, you already make so many assumptions that there's no point. So I started going by Ella Harry. Harry is my dad's name, or Harrison is my dad's name. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to make it Harry. And then I'm going to go by my last name, by my middle name, which is Ella. So I started using Ella in Fort St. John, but it was more so, oh, my white friends that I made in Fort St. John could call me Ella, but I wasn't necessarily using it on documents. I wasn't using it on like my resume or like school records or anything like that. But after that situation, I'm like, okay, it has to be Ella Harry, because if you see Ella Harry, you don't assume, oh, this is a Nigerian international student who is trying to figure out life. You just see Ella Harry and like, oh, this could be a white person, or this could be a non-person of color. And it's unfortunate to even say that making a move just like that, I would apply for jobs and I would get a call back right away. And sometimes I would even use my actual first and last name. Same thing on the resume, nothing changed, just the names. And it would be interesting that I wouldn't get callbacks for the same positions that I got callbacks from using the name Ella Harry. So it's just very interesting. And when you kind of think about, again, being so young and having to navigate that and not being able to make sense of it, I think it affects you in a way that is deeper than something you can explain. So now, of course, like, as an adult woman, now I'm starting to, if people mispronounce my name, I will correct them. I recently changed my name back from Ella. On LinkedIn, now it's Essie Ogene Uyu. I'm like, well, this is my name. This is who I am. This is me reclaiming my identity. But it took me almost a decade to do that, because as an international student, you have to find ways, unfortunately, to be able to navigate this world. You always feel like you have to find ways to fit in, because if you're not fitting in, you are standing out. And as a child, standing out is bad. Like, no, I don't want to stand out. I don't want anything that makes me stand out. I have to fit in. I have to be as Canadian as possible to get some of the Canadian experiences or the things that my colleagues are getting as well. But of course, like, as I'm getting older now, I'm reclaiming my identity. I'm like, I don't really care to fit in. I'm okay with standing out, but it wasn't always the case. And I can tell you it's not the case for a lot of international students who move from Nigeria. Okay, so fast forward now to 10 years later, things look so different. My life looks completely different from when I first moved to the city. And not just the fact that I was younger and still trying to figure things out, but even in terms of like self-growth, my life looks completely different. So after I graduated, as I mentioned earlier, I moved to BC. I got a job. I worked for a year and a half, applied for my permanent residency, moved back just before the pandemic started. And then I moved back here to continue working as a mental health professional. So my degree is in psychology. I have an undergrad degree from U of A in psych, and then I'm also in the process of wrapping up my master's in psychology as well, and I am training to be a psychologist. So that whole process has just been really interesting. I've gotten a lot of amazing opportunities. Something else that came up, which is, I think, kind of unexpected, because I never really saw myself as a creative person. But when I was in school, I needed an outlet, because I'm just like, I need something that is not my real life. Like, I almost needed like an escape from reality, which kind of sounds very, very, very bad, because it's like, how bad was your life that you needed to escape it, you know? So I needed an escape from reality. So I started creating content. And to me, it was just like, I didn't even see it as, oh, being a content creator. I'm like, oh, I'm just doing makeup, I'm modeling, I'm doing this, just like different things in the creative industry. Fast forward to now, I am a content creator and a blogger here in Edmonton. I've worked with so many amazing brands. I've had contracts with a major radio station here in Canada where I was talking about fashion and doing fashion journalism, which is something that I never imagined. When I tell you, I never imagined in my wildest dreams that my escape from reality when I was in school would be a reality that I am in fact like living outside of my 9 to 5 job. So I've had lots of opportunities. I've had self-growth. I think even as a person, in terms of my self-esteem, in terms of my identity as a Nigerian who also lives in Canada. If you ask me now, I'll tell you, oh, I'm Nigerian Canadian. Do I have a Canadian passport? No, I don't. But I'm Nigerian Canadian in my head, because at the end of the day, these are like two worlds that kind of have affected who I am as a person. What I would encourage you, if you are an international student, it is, I'm going to be real with you, it is challenging, but you will also find your people. So it might be challenging at first. I don't want to give you the wrong impression, or I don't want to make you have an expectation that will be so vastly different from the reality that you will have, but you will find your people. And as long as you find your people, you can just easily take things day by day, month by month, year by year, and things just get better. So with your community, talk to people about it. Like, talk to your friends about it. Find like mentors who are older than you, who can kind of understand the struggle. I wish that that was something that I had when I moved to Edmonton, because I didn't even know you could go like find older people, or they don't even have to be that much older than you, but even like 5 years or 4 years, people who have gone through what you're going through and can kind of advise you. I wish so badly that I had that, or I knew that that was an option. So if you have that, or you're able to find that either being on campus or at a church that you attend, like whatever that looks like, try to find a support person who can kind of help you and guide you. And if you're a parent, I can't even imagine how scary it must be to send your child to a different country not knowing what to expect. I cannot imagine how difficult it must be. Even for my parents, I think about it, I'm just like, I can't imagine how difficult it must be. One thing that I would say to parents is to please talk to your children, listen to them, because there's nothing worse than kids being in a different country and going through the things that you're going through and feeling like they can't even call their parents back home to say, I'm really struggling, or this is what is going on. Because sometimes you're like, oh, my parents have paid this much money, or like my parents kind of expect this from me, or I feel like I can't talk to my parents about certain things. So now they're having to go through all of these things alone. It is very scary. It is scary. It is a lot. It weighs a lot on your mental health. It even weighs a lot on your grades, because if you're so worried about other things, it's hard for you to actually focus in school. It's hard for you to get good grades, which of course That's what Nigerian parents want. You have to be getting good grades because I'm paying so much money for you to be here. So as a parent, try to make it a safe space. Try to make you a safe person where your children feel comfortable coming to you to say, I'm really struggling, or I want to come back home, or I want you to come and visit, or I need advice. Like whatever that looks like. It's already lonely being an international student. So it would be nice to make that journey just a little less lonely for them.